Hi, everybody. Well, let me talk about the setting. I'm out in my work shed. I've got total social distance from everybody except my storage and my ladders and my tools and things. Um, Also, the beard is an accident. I didn't try, I didn't set out to grow a beard, but I don't know. Maybe I'll keep it. Or maybe you can vote on it. I don't care. But anyway, here I am in my native habitat. And so it's kind of peaceful outside, and I thought I'd just record this first lecture out here. This is only going to be a few minutes, and it will be in preparation for our class tomorrow, which will be the 23rd. And it's fine if you watch this just after the lecture. I think it'll be better if you watch it before, but we can see what happens. Um, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the French Revolution. You've got several materials to read through, but I just want to give you a kind of basic, a sort of primer on the French Revolution. There's been a lot of different ways to look at the French Revolution. It's a little bit of a kind of Rorschach test. That's when you see those ink blots and you say, oh, that's a spider. And somebody else says, no, it's a dancer. And somebody else says, no, it's a modern building or whatever. In other words, you see in the revolution sometimes what you want to see. It's like interpretations of the Civil War or interpretations of other big movements in history like the fall of the Roman Empire or something. So the revolution is like that. It started in 1789. It's one of the most important events in modern European history, and in a way, it kind of sets up so much of what happens later on and how it happens, and how people think about governance and democracy and republics and monarchies and so forth. But it starts with the French monarchy. The great King Louis XIV died in 1715, and his great grandson, the other two intermediate links, had died in the meanwhile. And his great grandson was 5 years old and eventually took the throne as Louis XV, who was uh, raised to be a kind of dissolute king. He was one of those enlightened monarchs. He wasn't too rough on his subjects. He was too much of a playboy, really, to spend much time on governance. France was prosperous during Louis XV, um, but the fiscal um, workings of the government were broken. Louis XIV had pretty much run the French finances into the ground through his wars, through building Versailles, and all these other ways. I think you've already gotten a hint of that. And uh, the three big classes in France, the the estates, as they were called, were um, really treated unequally. There was the first estate and the second estate, that's the clergy and the nobility. And they formed a sort of each a sort of corporation unto themselves. And then so did the third estate, which was basically everybody else. So the third estate was the one that got taxed. The other two didn't. So that was quite unequal. Uh, the third estate itself included super rich commoners and the poorest of the poor peasants, so and urban workers. So it was a situation where there was a lot of inequality. Um, and as France continued to carry out these dynastic wars in that Louis XIV and his father had under had participated in, had waged, uh, France got into even worse shape. Uh, there was a war from 1740 to 48 that France got into. It's called the War of the Austrian Succession. And that was a serious, semi-global mix-up that ran French finances into the ground. And then another general war. If you hear the dog barking, it's just my dog Waldo, so don't worry about that. Um, and he's a Schnauzer, and Schnauzers are made to bark. That's all there is to it. But there's another set of wars that's crucial to our subject and also crucial to American history, not just to European. And that is the 7 Years' War, which began in 1756 and ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. And in that war, the French and other powers squared off against the British and other powers, and the British ended up winning. And they won big. It was a global war fought in the Americas. It was called the French and Indian War. It was a war that was fought in the Caribbean, was fought in India, in parts of Asia, other parts of Asia besides India. And the British won, took most of Canada away from the French, or all of Canada away from the French, took big chunks of India that the French had colonized away from the French. And it sets up in a way, it was so expensive, it sets up in a way the fact that governments were all, after it, were all attempting to pay for it. And so you may know the British case, where just before the American Revolution, that is right after the 7 Years' War, 1763, the British started taxing the colonies at a greater rate, and then the calls for no taxation without representation, and all these sorts of issues came up. Well, the same thing is happening in France, except we have these big classes, the rich classes of nobles and the church, which was the biggest property owner in France. And these entities didn't pay taxes, but everybody else did. So increasingly, the crown tried to get the nobles to pay taxes and the church to pay some taxes, but it didn't work, and they always refused. Well, in 1770, in the late 70s, Louis XIV, who was the grandson of Louis XV, not the great-grandson, but the grandson, came to power as a young man. His wife was Marie Antoinette. They're famous for having been in power at the time that the revolution broke out in '89. And they're a very interesting couple. I don't want to talk about them in this presentation. I will say that they've been mainly caricatured and misrepresented in history. They were not quite the nutty celebrity folks that sometimes they are represented as in movies and so forth. So it's not that cartoon version. And indeed, Louis XVI wanted to tax the nobles, take the burdens off the common people. He also wanted to get back at the British after they took so much from France in the 7 Years' War. And so one thing that happened was that when the American Revolution broke out in 1775-76, the French supported the American Revolution, and Louis XVI accepted this as a necessity to get back at France, but it made the finances even worse. So after the American Revolution, which ended in 1783, the War of the American Revolution, which ended in '83, the French and Louis XVI were just desperate to pay for all that. They had helped the Americans, right? They came in on the American side and helped defeat the British on sea and on land too. And what happened then was that Louis XVI just pressures the nobles, and he tries to pressure them by bringing all the estates, all the classes together in Paris in the spring of 1789. All the classes gather, but they don't trust him, and especially the Third Estate says, we want a constitution, we want a parliament, we want you not to be an absolute king. And Louis XVI kind of agreed. His wife Marie Antoinette didn't like it, but he kind of agreed. And then things got out of hand. And then the crowd rose up in Paris and started murdering people who they associated with the regime. And then that really begins the revolution. So, like the American Revolution, it begins with a tax revolt. I think we'd say. Has to do with people who see themselves as unequal in some ways, and they're trying to get theirs back. But the revolution immediately turns to some violence in the streets that's very undemocratic in a way. And that's what we'll talk about in some later episodes of our remotely delivered classes here. So anyway, that's all I wanted to do with this little recording, and I will see you soon. Thanks.